Essentials of Christian Thought is the philosophy of the Bible. And philosophy has two major branches. One is metaphysics, which is the study of ultimate reality or the reality behind things that appear to us in everyday life. What's really real? What's ultimately real? What's finally real? Well, none of the things that we actually meet and experience in everyday life deserve those labels. So metaphysics asks, what's the ultimate reality behind all things and that connects all things? But there's another branch of philosophy called epistemology. I think metaphysics and epistemology are inseparable. They're interdependent. And I think the Bible addresses both, even if not directly. Epistemology has to do with how we know, what it's possible to know. In this section, I'm going to be talking about thinking Christianly. That may be an odd phrase to some people. Christianly isn't a word you'll probably find in most dictionaries. But I believe that there is a biblical Christian way of thinking and knowing. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about now. Metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. Metaphysics is belief in anything supernatural. And I'm going to be talking about what supernatural means, so don't let that word put you off right now. But I'm also going to be talking first about epistemology, thinking about knowing, how we know and what we know. Of course, one way that this has been expressed throughout the centuries by Christians and others is the relationship between faith and reason. How do faith and reason relate to each other? That's been one of the major preoccupations and problems of Christian thought for 2,000 years. But in order to set the background of thinking Christianly, I have to talk about a crisis, a modern crisis that began with what we call the Enlightenment in the 1600s and then gained steam throughout the 1700s, and we're still living with the fallout of that crisis. And it began in Europe, spread to America, and then around the world with what I call the Enlightenment, but also the scientific revolutions. And this was a crisis of faith and reason, with both Christian and non-Christian thinkers asking, are they compatible, or do we need to separate them? Is it possible that we should only call knowing things that can be proven with evidence and reason, to the exclusion of faith, so that faith is then not really a way of knowing? So epistemology in the modern world especially creates a conflict, and I'll even call it a crisis of faith and reason. With the Enlightenment came what we call foundationalism. Now, foundationalism is a big word that's foreign to many people. You might recognize it more as what might be called rationalism. A way that some philosophers have described it is the rise of belief in the omnicompetence of reason. That is, human reason, working by itself, without revelation, without faith, is capable of knowing everything that is important to know. So foundationalism is also known as rationalism, and it really began with the Enlightenment, in this modern sense that created a crisis and even a conflict between faith and reason. And perhaps the furthest experience and extension of that crisis is what we call positivism, which really arose in the 20th century on the back of foundationalism and rationalism. Positivism says we really should not believe anything that cannot be proven scientifically through evidence and reason. It's an extreme form of rationalism. Well, all of this arose within the universities of Europe and North America, and we're still living with the fallout of the rise of Enlightenment, rationalism, and then positivism, and it has created a crisis for Christian faith and for Christian thought. Another problem that's part of that crisis is, out of the Enlightenment came a deep doubt and uncertainty about metaphysics. In fact, someone in the 20th century called metaphysics the sick man of philosophy, because so many philosophers, both Christian and non-Christian, were turning away from metaphysics, the study of ultimate reality, and saying, you know, we really can't know anything about ultimate reality. Perhaps only through faith in some revelation of God can we know anything about ultimate reality. But wait, modern Enlightenment rationalism says that's not knowledge. So the crisis is a redefining of knowledge and saying that knowledge only includes what can be proven. and metaphysics is a branch of philosophy without proof. So if you're going to believe in any ultimate reality behind the appearances of things that we normally experience, then that's metaphysics, and we can't really call that knowledge. So modern philosophy has tended to take metaphysics and set it aside and relegate it to a realm of faith, divorced from knowledge. So we're talking about a difference here between proof and opinion, and many modern philosophers have said they're totally separate. You can have your opinions if you want to, and everything based on faith and rooted in revelation is mere opinion. But what we talk about in science and in the best of philosophy is knowledge, and that's what can be proven with reason. However, in the 20th century, something different began to happen in philosophy. Some philosophers themselves began to question rationalism and positivism and say, no, actually, they're not totally separate things, that is, faith and knowledge. All knowing includes some dimension of faith. What this amounted to was a rediscovery of the inevitability of subjectivity, that is, perspective. The individuals and different groups' perspectives began to come back into the picture of philosophy, whereas they had been banished to the realm of faith alone for a century or more. So the 20th century began to see a decline of belief in rationalism. Problems arose, such as a philosopher by the name of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a big German-sounding name, but he actually taught at Cambridge University in England, who revolutionized philosophy away from that Enlightenment fascination with the omnicompetence of reason and a kind of search for a universal truth through reason alone and the banishing of metaphysics. Ludwig Wittgenstein is often credited with really being the philosopher who launched postmodernism or postmodernity, which I'll talk about in more detail later. So Wittgenstein began to ask questions such as, well, how can you prove that knowledge is only what can be proven? A conundrum, or what philosophers call an aporia of philosophy itself, especially Enlightenment philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that there is no one approach to knowing. In fact, he went so far as to argue that there are different language games, as he called them. Now, what's the point of all of this? The point of all of it is that there was a new opening in philosophy itself to faith. Wittgenstein was admitting that faith plays a role in all of our knowing, so that knowing cannot be pinned only to proof. Different people groups, even different individuals, have different perspectives on reality. So we call this new approach that really arose with Wittgenstein, who died in 1952, post-foundationalism, and it's really at the heart of postmodern philosophy. There have been other philosophers who have come along and supported the same idea of reuniting or integrating faith and reason. Another one is a Catholic philosopher by the name of Alasdair MacIntyre, who taught for many years at the University of Notre Dame. And he has argued, and I think Wittgenstein would agree, that all knowing is actually shaped by some tradition and community that carries forth that tradition. Another philosopher, and the last one I'll mention for now, is R.M. Hare, H-A-R-E. And he actually invented a word, and the word is blick. B-L-I-K. Sometime in the 1950s, that word became popular, and Hare is responsible for it. And what does it mean? A blick is a certain perspective of an individual or a group, a community, on reality. Hare, Alasdair MacIntyre, Wittgenstein, all kind of come together in this process of challenging the omnicompetence of reason that arose with the Enlightenment and the reintroducing of faith, at least as perspective that can't be proven, into philosophy. All of this amounted to a reopening of the door to knowing that includes some element of faith, and the defeat of the rationalism of the Enlightenment that reigned for 150 to 250 years. Now, many people have thought that this new postmodern, post-foundationalist opening to faith that we kind of put under the category of postmodernism is incompatible with metaphysics. Metaphysics remains the sick man of philosophy, something that we don't do. Metaphysics has had a very poor reputation for several hundred years now, beginning with the Enlightenment especially. But even in the postmodern world, many philosophers, such as those I've mentioned, do not think highly of metaphysics. One British Christian philosopher who has especially influenced me in another direction is James Richmond, who worked hard to bring together this new emphasis on perspective, beginning with Wittgenstein and post-foundationalist thought with metaphysics. So perspective and metaphysics can actually go together. James Richmond actually labeled this new approach to metaphysics existential map making, and I like that term for it. We all have maps of reality in our minds, whether we're really aware of it or not. And the question I'm asking and talking about when I talk about essentials of Christian thought is there a Christian map of reality? Does the biblical story, does Christian thought, carved out of the biblical story over 2,000 years, contain implicit within itself a Christian map of reality? Well, that would be a Christian metaphysics, and it's partly based on God's revelation of himself and faith. So my argument is that this post-foundationalist, postmodern philosophy, beginning with Wittgenstein and carrying through MacIntyre and Hare and others, and James Richmond is the one who really gave me this idea, can be combined with metaphysics if we define metaphysics as existential map-making. James Richmond talked with Wittgenstein in the background about seeing reality as something. That's simply another way of expressing this perspective that I'm talking about. When we read the Bible and study it closely and think about it in this way as containing an implicit map of reality, we begin to see that there is a perspective on reality that the biblical authors all assumed and took for granted. But again, the Bible is not a philosophy textbook, so it has to be discerned within the story that the Bible gives us of God. So knowing reality in itself is always a task of metaphysical map making. Now, some people would say that metaphysical visions, these maps that I'm talking about, these perspectives on ultimate reality, are always irrational because they contain an element of faith and perhaps even are based on some revelation from ultimate reality. But just because they are perspectives does not mean that they're irrational. Reason and faith can be brought back together, and that's a major task of Christian philosophy, to reunite faith and reason. A world perspective or map of reality such as I'm talking about here, that I believe the Bible actually contains, can be tested, even if not proven true or false. After foundationalism began to die with Wittgenstein, that is, in the postmodern world of thought and philosophy, we are beginning to recognize that knowing can exist without proof. That is, there are many things that we cannot prove that we can still claim as knowledge. For example, the essentials of Christian thought, or what I'm calling Christian philosophy. Biblical Christian philosophy is a perspective on reality, and I call it knowledge, even though I admit, like most really important things, it can't be proven or disproven by reason or evidence alone. My thesis in thinking about and teaching about the essentials of Christian thought is that the Bible communicates a coherent map of reality that better answers life's ultimate questions than any of its alternatives. We all have ultimate questions about reality, such as, why am I here? What is the meaning of not only my life, but all of life? Does life have a purpose? Is there a reason for creation itself? Is there life after death, or is this life all there is? Those are examples of life's ultimate questions. Metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that attempts to answer those questions. I believe that the Bible actually contains the answers to life's ultimate questions, and that's what I mean by the essentials of Christian thought, and I believe that though The biblical map of reality cannot be proven, especially to someone whose mind is closed to any revelation or faith. It actually answers life's ultimate questions better than any of the alternatives, such as I talked about earlier, called secular humanism. Let me return to that word blick that philosopher R.M. Hare coined. It's a very common term. After his life and death, we use it a lot in philosophy. And that is that idea of having a perspective, a certain perspective on reality. Hare and others like him said, you know what? There is no view from nowhere. There is no human being who stands on a mountaintop of knowing and can claim to have no perspective, but only a direct, objective vision of reality itself. That whole idea of pure objective knowing, of escaping from all perspective, of having a view on reality from nowhere has pretty much died. And that's actually an opening for reuniting faith and reason and discovering or rediscovering a biblical Christian perspective on reality that I'm calling the essentials of Christian thought. So admittedly, the biblical Christian metaphysical vision or perspective on ultimate reality is a view from somewhere, not a view from nowhere. It's rooted in God's revelation in the story of the Bible, and it's also based on faith, but I believe it's not irrational. Along with postmodernism has come a certain type of theology rooted in the postmodern revolution against the Enlightenment rationalism, and this new form of theology, Christian theology, has been labeled, unfortunately, post-liberalism. I'm going to talk about that. I actually adopt that approach, even though I don't like the term post-liberal, but that's what it's come to be known as. And it includes in its essence, in its center, a valuing of narrative. Narrative or story, post-liberal theologians say, is actually a way of knowing. In fact, all knowing is based on a certain perspective that's rooted in a story about reality. So narrative theology, as we call it, is part of post-liberal theology, and post-liberal theology is based on postmodern thought, which really began with Wittgenstein. One of my favorite post-liberal theologians is a man that I knew for a while. He died unexpectedly at a fairly young age, but his name was William Plaker, and he taught at a Christian college in Indiana. And William Plaker was, I believe, the best exponent of post-liberal theology. But he was actually tutored in it by his Yale professor named Hans Frey. And what's at the basis of post-liberal theology? It is the idea that both Plaker and Frey communicate to us, but I actually grew up with the idea so that when I first heard their term for it, I said to myself, that's what I was raised with. And the idea is letting the biblical story absorb the world. Let me say it again. Letting the biblical story absorb the world. Now that may seem like a strange phrase, but the first time I heard it, I kind of knew what it meant because that's the way I was raised in a Christian home and church, was to let the biblical story, the narrative that God gives us about himself and about us and about all of reality in the Bible, that is what determines and governs my perspective on reality. That's where my map of reality comes from. Letting the Bible absorb the world means not taking the Bible to some other map of reality, some other metaphysical perspective, and asking, now what can we still believe? Or what does this mean? Hans Frey and William Plaker said, as Christians, our task is to let the Bible absorb the world. That is, the biblical story actually gives us a map of reality. And all these other worldviews and perspectives out there are helpful in some cases, but we don't let them absorb the Bible. We let the Bible determine how we see reality. We see reality as something because of the biblical story and our place in it. Our whole life is absorbed into that story, and it absorbs the world for us. The point is that the meaning of the Bible is not outside of itself in some other philosophy, and that's why it's important to discover a biblical philosophy. Because there are so many different maps of reality, metaphysical perspectives out there in the world. And our tendency often is to blend them together, but they actually conflict at some basic points. So the meaning of the Bible is not out there in some other philosophy. We do not need to correlate the Bible with secular humanism, for example, or with New Age Gnostic philosophy or something like that. But many people have been tempted to try to do that. And the result has been inappropriate syncretism between the biblical worldview and philosophy and those. Yes, Christian truth, the essentials of Christian truth are tied up with a series of stories in the Bible that together form the biblical, what philosophers call meta-narrative, large overarching story about reality. But that biblical story, that biblical meta-narrative, contains an inner logic that Christian philosophy and theology attempts to discern and develop and communicate to ourselves and to those around us. And that inner logic is what I earlier called the essentials of Christian thought, but also biblical personalism. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about biblical personalism as we go through this talk of essentials of Christian thought. So what I've tried to do in this section is to talk about the underbrush, that is in philosophy, Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment philosophy, that we need to try to understand in order to go further in our understanding of biblical philosophy.